Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. So we're into a federal election, and I got two excellent people to welcome into a panel discussion of what we're going to expect and what the issues are tonight. And they're both honorable. The Honorable Sergio Marchi and the Honorable Tony Clement. Sergio Marchi, someone that historically has been a very successful business person, academic, and Liberal Party MP, as well as cabinet minister. And Tony Clement, similar, very involved in, both of them involved in Toronto city politics, and Tony Clement as well in provincial politics as an MPP and a cabinet minister, and federal politics as both a member of parliament and a cabinet minister. Both of them serving in government, serving in opposition, and being involved in politics for a long period of time. So, gentlemen, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Thank you, Brian. Good to be here.
So maybe, Sergio, I could start with you if I could, sir. Tell me, we're into an election campaign. What do you think is going to happen?
Well, I think it's going to be very similar to the campaign of 1988, and that's when the entire campaign revolved around one issue, essentially, and that was, do we enter a free trade agreement with the United States? And back then, of course, Brian Mulroney proposed that, and John Turner, as uncomfortable as I was at the time, was against the deal. Since then, we've come to realize how important that deal was to Canada. But the point I'm making is that it was basically a referendum on the free trade agreement with the United States. And I think that's going to be very similar in this election this year, with the one issue that's going to overwhelm, and that is Donald Trump. And I think people are anxious and concerned, and justifiably so. And they will want to know from their leaders, how do you propose to deal with Trump? How do you protect us against the tariffs? How do you grow Canadian prosperity? And ultimately, how do you protect our sovereignty and security? I think that's issue number one, and I think it's going to be overwhelming. It's unfair on so many other issues if that's what happens, because a lot of issues are legitimately important. But when you have a public that has an overwhelming public policy anxiety, that's what happens. I think they are going to dictate the pace and tone of this campaign.
Tony Clement, the 1988 election, you had two parties that had different points of view. You don't have necessarily parties that have two different points of view on this referendum that Sergio Marchi is talking about. How do the two different leaders differentiate themselves?
Well, thank goodness, Brian, the election is called, because Carney was stealing so many Pierre Poilievre policies at a rate that was head-spinning that I didn't know where to turn to next. It was like he was running for the Conservative Party leadership all of a sudden. So that is over. Now we're into a proper campaign. I actually agree with Sergio. I was thinking the same thing, but for different reasons, about how this is similar to the 1988 campaign, a campaign that I was a campaign manager in the great downtown riding of Davenport. And so for me, the campaign may be similar in that at the middle part of the campaign, which was a long campaign, by the way, it was like over 60 days or something. The Liberals were 10 points ahead. John Turner was 10 points ahead on this Canadian nationalism aspect, and then cooler heads prevailed, and then the Conservatives triumphed to another majority government. So we'll see why it is similar to 1988. Either Sergio's analysis or my analysis will prove accurate. I actually don't think it's going to be entirely about the Trump tariffs. Everybody knows about the Trump tariffs. Everybody knows how injurious that is to Canada and how stupid those tariffs are. But I actually think the opening of the campaign means that we can actually talk about longer term, more deep-seated issues about the future of the country, particularly economically, but also militarily and politically. And I think that actually redounds to Pierre Poilievre's favor, that the now that the actual election is called, we can talk about things like our competitiveness, our our tax structure, how we reward people to make in business. As you know, they've got to sometimes put their skin in the game and be innovative. And how do we create that in our society to a better extent? We have real problems in Canada. Our per capita GDP is falling like a stone. Our tax rates are not competitive. So I believe that within the context of the Trump tariffs, you can talk about these things as well.
Sergio, in the last Ontario election, the opposition really tried to get the topic onto other issues, not the issues that Tony Clement is talking about, but on, wait times in hospitals and social issues, et cetera. And the playbook that Doug Ford followed was, Trump all day, Trump nonstop. And it seemed to work. And consistent with what you were arguing, the ballot box question was, who do you think can best deal with Donald Trump? So is Tony right that we're going to be talking about a whole bunch of other issues, tax structure, competitiveness, defense, et cetera? Or is it going to be all on who's best to deal with Donald Trump?
Well, first of all, Doug Ford, I think, proved my point. We'll see if the federal election mirrors the provincial. But Doug Ford, quite frankly, was called Captain Canada. And it came at a time when Justin Trudeau had resigned. He was a lame duck. Carney had not appeared yet. And quite frankly, I take my hat off to Doug's strength and to his practicality, and who spoke the real words when it was necessary with both Americans and Ontarians. And it wasn't a surprise that he was returned with a majority. I don't think Tony is wrong by listing military, competitiveness, tax structure, but I think that's all going to be an outgrowth of the overarching issue of Donald Trump. The fact that we have to build a stronger economy to weather these tariffs. What does that mean? Getting rid of internal trade, as Mark Carney said yesterday, by Canada Day. That has to do with building our economy, growing our economy. And so those issues will obviously be up for discussion, but I think it's going to be in the context of what Trump is doing, not only to Canada, but to the world. And I was quite struck yesterday by the negativity of the conservative leader, Poilievre. Everything is broken, everything is bad, everything has to be rebuilt from scratch, which I believe strains credibility. Canadians know that they've built a good country. They shouldn't be penalized with all this negativity. And there you had Mark Carney standing very positive, very credible, very decent, talking about change, talk about improving, but not running our country down the way Poilievre has such an easy time in doing.
But Sergio, if I could, Tony's right that several of the policies that he's talked about are more right-wing or at least centrist than certainly Justin Trudeau and the Liberal government. Getting rid of the increase in the capital gains tax, getting rid of the consumer carbon tax, more of a focus on productivity, competitiveness, et cetera. Is the fact that he's moving, whether you call it to the right or to the center, a negative or a positive?
No, I think it's a very positive. What it says is that Carney is independent of Justin Trudeau, despite Poilievre's best attempts to make them one and the same and calling him his economic advisor in the fourth term. The fact is that Carney is credible economically speaking. He's a smart guy. He's moving to the center. I think there was too much to the left. I think that was one of the reasons why there was great fatigue with Justin Trudeau. And now that he's gone, plus the factor of Donald Trump, means it's a horse race. It's still going to be touch and go. It's up for grabs. But I think Poilievre will have a tough time saying that Trudeau and Carney are the same thing when you see that Carney is independently moving in a direction that he believes in, even though it's different from Justin Trudeau. And that's the prerogative of any new leader, whether you're a Liberal or a Conservative.
Yeah, but it's going to be tough for the Liberal campaign to say how scary Pierre Poilievre is when the Liberals keep stealing Poilievre's policies too. That it cuts both ways. And I also take issue with Sergio saying how negative Pierre is, because actually, at the launch of his campaign, he's been very positive about the future of the country, saying, "Look, we can fix things. We've got to do things differently." But this is a country of great hope and great opportunity. He weaves in the backstory of himself and his wife, and the hopes and opportunities that their parents had for them, which is the Canadian story, and that's the storytelling Pierre is talking about in a positive vision for the country. So, for those who were skittish about Pierre because he was the leader of the opposition, and therefore the leader of the opposition has to oppose and be negative a lot of the time. I used to say, Sergio, there's only 4 words you needed to know in opposition. Those bastards did what? So that's opposition. But now we're in a campaign, and Pierre has successfully, I would argue, pivoted to saying, okay, we know that things can be better. We know that Canada has great hope and great opportunity. Here's the pathway to get there. And that's what his campaign, I believe, is going to be all about.
We're going to take a break for some messages and come back in 2 minutes with Sergio Marchi, the Honorable Sergio Marchi, and Tony Clement, the Honorable Tony Clement, a Liberal and Conservative former member of Parliament, Cabinet Minister, and member of Provincial Parliament and Cabinet Minister, as well as MP, in just 2 minutes. These gentlemen have got long history with both politics and the Liberal Party and the Conservative Party. And government, and know some of the challenges that we're faced with, and know the individuals that are our current leaders and our potential future prime ministers. And so I think that we've got a great panel for you today. Stay with us, everyone. Back in 2 minutes. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. So we're into an election campaign now. The leaders of the Liberal Party and the Conservative Party and other parties have now announced that we're on the campaign airplanes and campaign buses and traveling across the country over the course of the next couple of weeks to earn your vote. And it's going to be, as we've talked about, an interesting campaign, probably one of the most important. And we always say this, it's the most important election in history, but this one just might be. Tony Clement, I want to turn to you. And by the way, my panelists today are the Honorable Tony Clement and the Honorable Sergio Marchi, a Liberal Cabinet Minister, a Conservative Cabinet Minister, and both long-term involved in politics. Tony, I want to turn to you, if I could, and ask you about sort of the leadership capabilities and experience of the two different candidates for Prime Minister. And it looks, like this time it's going to be a head-to-head. Every election sort of is a head-to-head, but even more so this time with the NDP and the Bloc Québécois down in the polls, it really appears that this is going to be even more of a head-to-head election than every other election seems to be. Some people will say that Mark Carney, with his economic credentials and background as governor of the Bank of Canada, governor of the Bank of England, et cetera, has sort of got that right experience set. Other people would say, no, he's a technocrat. He's never been in elected politics. He doesn't know what government's all about. He doesn't know what politics is all about. What do you have to say about the different experience sets of the two potential prime ministers?
Well, they are quite different, Brian. You're right about that. And I think there are pluses and minuses for both, to be frank and honest with you. Certainly, Mark Carney spent a lot of his time overseas. And so I do wonder whether he's actually connected to what Canadians have been going through and are feeling. He did have a stint, of course, as governor of the Bank of Canada under the Harper government included. I think there was praise there but I thought it was quite unseemly of him to suggest that he was the driving force of our how Canada responded to the financial crisis of 2008 and the Great Recession that followed. He was the Bank of Canada governor, but Jim Flaherty and Stephen Harper had more than a little to do with that, and to try to take on that mantle when the late Jim Flaherty is no longer with us to kind of defend his record as finance minister. I thought that was a bit unseemly, but anyway, that's now a couple of weeks old, and we move ahead. Pierre Poilievre, of course, has a long and storied career in the House of Commons. Some see that as a positive, some see it as a negative. But he knows politics, and more importantly, he understands how government works. He was in cabinet with me. He understands the levers of power. It's one thing to be passionate about change for the better, but if you don't actually know how government works, it can go off the rails quite quickly. I would just suggest the United States is a good example of that these days. But I think their value proposition is somewhat different. The one thing I would say, though, Brian, is that Pierre Poilievre is the greatest communicator in a generation in the Conservative Party. There's no doubt about that. He knows how to talk to people. He knows how to express their hopes and aspirations. And I think that is really going to come through in flying colors as the campaign projects itself. So that's definitely on the positive side for Pierre Poilievre, I'd say.
So, Jean-Marc, same question. Do you want a career politician or do you want a career technocrat?
Well, I think you mentioned that this election, we often say this, could be historic, but this might be a special election if you consider the context of the challenge from America, both economically and politically. We have not seen this caliber of a challenge to nationhood since the Second World War. And so the times we live in have a way of influencing who we select as our political leaders. And I think when you look at these two men, there's no question that Pierre is quick off his feet. I would say that the best communicator of this generation for Tories was Brian Mulroney. Plus, he's got the charm. He wasn't the angry person.
Sergio, he's not our generation anymore. That was the previous generation.
No, he's close enough. But I think he was number one in terms of communication and passion. But I think when you look at the times dictating our leaders, right now we're going through economic turbulence and national anxiety thanks to Donald Trump. And I think the two CVs, nothing wrong with Pierre being a career politician, but I think right now the polls are indicating, and they can change on a dime, but what Canadians are seeing is that they are comfortable and confident with Mark Carney, who speaks economically and has dealt with economic issues. His positions as governor, both in in Canada and the United Kingdom, with respect to their banks, I think speaks to the kind of confidence that people want at a time where there is, as I said, significant turbulence. Is economic know-how more important or political know-how? Obviously, you need both. And in that, I think Carney, for a non-political guy in the last 10 days, has been incredibly sure-footed. I mean, no thanks to Trudeau, who left him absolutely no runway, which means that everything had to be fast-forwarded. But he's been sure-footed. He's been smart with the meetings. He's been smart going to Europe. So right now, I'd have to say that he's doing the politics pretty good. We'll find out if he can do the pressure of a campaign. But I think his economic know-how is his trump card, pardon the pun.
Tony, he seems to have had some experience, very relevant experience outside of Canada, as governor of the United Kingdom, and also as a director of the Financial Stability Board, where he made contacts with a lot of the people that he's now dealing with in Europe and around the world, etc. Some people are going to try to depict that as Michael Ignatieff, just visiting, and that he spent too much time out of Canada. How do you think the Conservatives are going to best combat his international experience?
Yeah, I think they're going to look at his record, and there's a lot to pick apart there in the UK in particular, where a lot of the central bank governors of the day were into quantitative easing to deal with any of the economic pressures that we were facing, and that basically means printing a heck of a lot of money. And and their attitude was quantitative easing works because we have no inflation, so we don't have to worry about inflationary pressures. Well, guess what? When you print all that money, you actually create inflation. And Pierre Poilievre has been on this point for years and warning Canadians as an MP, backbench MP, then as leader, saying, look, we can't keep printing money and expecting that our economy is going to be a good economy. And now we're in a situation where they had to jack up the interest rates because inflation was rampant. That hurts every Canadian, every person who's trying to buy a house or buy groceries. And so, yeah, I think that he has a track record, and it's going to be, I think, absolutely fine for Pierre or others to say, look, let's look at your track record and compare it to what Canada needs for the future. And what Canada needs for the future is real economic growth, not printing of money. That means building pipelines, building the infrastructure, keeping taxes low, dealing with government massive deficits for no good reason, trimming back the bureaucracy. These are things that Conservatives can talk about and will have legitimacy in talking about.
Let's stay on record and resume for a second, Sergio, if I could. My understanding is that the Mark Carney was in the Department of Finance with Chrétien and Martin when budgets were cut fairly dramatically, and then worked, as Governor of the Bank of Canada, as Tony said, with Jim Flaherty and Stephen Harper through the Great Recession. So much so successfully that the rumor is Stephen Harper actually offered him the Minister of Finance portfolio.
That's not the real story, Brian. I know the real story. I can't tell it, but that's not the real story. But anyway,
okay.
Carry on.
Is that record good for a potential Liberal Prime Minister, or is that the kiss of death?
When we have national elections, international issues largely go missing in action. In other words, all politics is local, as we know. So domestic issues overwhelm what's happening in the world. Well, the other reason why I think this election is going to be special is because the international perspective is going to be much, much more present, much, much more important in this national election because of what America is doing fundamentally to Canada. But let's face the music, also to the world. I mean, Trump doesn't give a damn about the welfare of any other nation. He wants all investments and monies to flow to America as if no one else co-inhabited the planet. And people talk about him being America first. No, he's not. He's America only. He sees the world through the prism of G1. He couldn't give a hoot about G7 or G20. So all of a sudden, international issues are going to dominate. And who would you rather have as your prime minister? Someone who's actually dealt with the world, someone who knows about international economic theory and practice, someone who's met with the leaders of the world, someone who's got relationships beyond Canada. I think without a doubt, if this campaign is going to be revolving around how we defend ourselves and grow our economy because of the threat of Donald Trump, then I think Mark Carney is going to be seen as an asset by a majority of Canadians. Not all. That's what happens in a democracy. But he's going into the election with a great deal of momentum. Everybody thought until Trump came along that the Tories were going to wipe the streets. And it looked like that because we have cyclical swings of the political pendulum. So that's the good news for the Liberal Party. The bad news is for the last 2 months, Trump has been terrorizing us. So I see his strengths and his CV as a very strong asset going into this national election.
Tony, you've talked about how you think Pierre Poilievre is this great communicator. Mark Carney hasn't been tested in retail politics other than during the Liberal leadership race, which was very fast, very quick, and really only with a couple 100,000 people, not everyone. The last sort of experience we've had with a very intelligent person, I think, running nationally was Michael Ignatieff, who proved to not be great at retail politics at all. Tell me, how how do you think that's going to play? The con that some people would say about Pierre Poilievre, and Sergio has mentioned it already, is his negativity. Some people say all he does is speak in slogans, but he is an incredibly charismatic individual that does communicate very well. Versus Carney, who has shown, some people would say, disdain for reporters' questions, a little bit of impatience, and while he's got great experience, the great experience has been as the head of organizations, not democratic political parties.
Yeah, it's an open question. Look, I'm trying to be fair and balanced here, even though I'm biased, and say this. Look, that's the challenge that Mark Carney has. Let's put it that way. That he hasn't had any experience as a retail politician, which is a very different skill set from managing corporate and government elites in London or Geneva or wherever, or Ottawa. So that's going to be interesting. I would, the critique of Pierre that all he has is slogans is now a bit dated, because he has been announcing policy by the pound over the last couple of weeks or so in terms of internal trade, tax policy, building pipelines, skilled trades development, those kinds of things. So yeah, he's going to have a full and flushed out platform. So the sloganeering critique of Pierre, I don't think is going to really matter that much. Mark Carney has a lot of clever advisors, many of them who earned their stripes during the Trudeau years. They haven't changed very much. I think of Gerald Butts as an example. He was very successful under Justin Trudeau, and he seems to be joined at the hip to Mark Carney. So yeah, I mean, there's going to be a lot of clever people around the Liberal leader. And but that's the challenge they have. Like, as you know, Brian, and Sergio, it's events, dear boy, events, as they say in Britain, right? You can have a plan until you get punched in the face, as Mike Tyson said here on this continent. So we'll see how Mark Carney deals with situations that come up inevitably in a campaign that you haven't thought about, or that take you by surprise, and then you've got to be able to think on your feet. I have a lot of confidence that Pierre can handle that. Pierre Poilievre can handle that. I don't know Mark Carney. I had dinner with him once in Ottawa when I was industry minister and he was the governor of the bank. That's the only interaction I've had with the man. So all I can tell you is I know what the challenge he faces, and he's going to have to meet that challenge in a very short political period of time.
Sergio, my understanding is that two times John Turner was in the lead in the polls, and both times ended up losing the elections. Kim Campbell was in the lead in the polls and had a honeymoon after her election as leader of the Conservative Party and as Prime Minister, and lost in one of the biggest defeats in Canadian electoral history, if not, I think it was actually the biggest defeat.
Yeah.
And Stephen Harper was leading in the polls in 2015 and went down to a defeat. I think it was one of the longest election campaigns, and people have said that if it wasn't for the length of the campaign, Stephen Harper may have still been elected as Prime Minister. So what do you think with Mark Carney's lack of retail experience? And we've got a short campaign, it would appear. What are your concerns about what's going to happen? Polls are fickle. 20-point lead for the Conservatives just 3 months ago, down to a neck and neck race right now.
It shows you the dynamism and the fluidity of politics, which is one of the attractions that attracted Tony and I to the business of public service. No 2 days are alike. Today could be sunny and tomorrow could be stormy. And we've seen that time in and time again. And I think the $64,000 question is how Carney will fare in the rough and tumble of an election. This is his first political rodeo. I think he's well aware of that. But what do I look at when I don't know the man? I haven't even had dinner with him, unlike Tony. But the first thing I see is he did a very successful Liberal leadership campaign. Not only did he not slip, but he won with a margin of 85%, which is absolutely overwhelming when you think that Freeland was a senior minister for 10 years and she got what, 8%? With the others three. So he blew his competition away, not because he slipped, but I think because of his appeal. Secondly, he's had roughly 10 days as prime minister, and every day he's made it count. He hasn't slipped up. I think he's been very credible, very calm, very positive. And so I feel good as a Liberal the way Mark Carney is entering the campaign. Now, we don't know who will emerge as a prime minister, but I like his disposition, and I'm a little, again, surprised because I'm sure Tories have as good advisors as the Liberals do, and why they allow Pierre to be such a negative, angry young man is beside me, because that doesn't sell. You can communicate all you want, but if your body language and your tone is negative and angry, people won't be attracted to you, not in the numbers that he needs to become prime minister.
You know, Tony, this hour is 22 minutes, has made a couple of skits about exactly this topic, about how unbelievably negative Pierre Poilievre has and can be. Can he overcome that?
Well, I just don't think it's true. So there's the first issue that we have with that. I think it's a mischaracterization and a caricature of the man. I've attended rallies. Most recently, last month in Ottawa, with the big Canada First rally to talk about the Trump tariffs and to talk about the future of the campaign. And he was, we talked about the Liberal record. I think it's our right to do that as an opposition party. I don't think that's being negative. I think that's saying, hey, this is what we have to change in order for the country to move forward. But no, I think he's going to be very positive. I think he's going to be smiling. He's going to be direct with people, saying, look, there's a better future. We don't have to have another term of Liberals to actually prosper as a country. In fact, that will not help us at all. So I think that you're going to see that side of him. And I think Anna, if I may be so bold, Anna Poilievre, his wife, I think is a very positive factor and humanizing factor, if you want to use it that way, in the campaign. She's going to be out there campaigning with her husband. So I'm not really worried about that, to be honest with you, gentlemen. I think that Pierre has a very charming disposition, and I think that's gonna come out during the writ period.
I think we should low bridge Pierre and put Anna on the stage. Frankly,
she's great, but she loves her husband and she wants him to be prime minister. So there you go.
Mark, I've never heard Mark Carney's wife speak, but my God, from a resume standpoint, she's a pretty impressive individual too. The one big change is going to be that for the last month, maybe 2 months, Mark Carney and the Liberal Party has sort of owned the media attention, and it's been difficult for Pierre Poilievre to cut through. And so this next month is going to be very different. We're going to take a break for some messages and be back with my two panelists, the Honorable Tony Clement, the Honorable Sergio Marchi, in just 2 minutes. And I'm going to ask them to change topic for a couple of minutes and talk about some of these policies that I think are going to be key, both for the campaign as well as for whoever becomes the Prime Minister of Canada in a month's time. Stay with us, everyone. Back in 2 minutes. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. I'm just so excited today to have my panelists with me, Sergio Marchi, the Honorable, and Tony Clement, the Honorable, with us, a Liberal and a Conservative Cabinet Minister, MP, in the case of Tony Clement, MPP as well, and also both of them involved in Toronto City politics. And so people that really know our politics across Canada and specifically in Toronto, Ontario as well. And people think that 905 is going to be probably... people have said the 905 is going to decide who gets to become prime minister, and Ontario and Quebec are going to decide whether it's a majority prime ministership or a minority prime ministership. And so I think it's going to be kind of interesting. I want to turn, if I could, for a couple of minutes to a couple of policies. This past weekend, there were numerous different articles in the paper and a lot of attention on media in regards to our national defense strategy and whether it can continue to be as coordinated with the United States going forward, or whether it's got to be more independent. It's going to the jets that we buy. Should we be buying them from the United States or from elsewhere? Should we have continuation of NORAD, where it's an American that is the, I don't know what you call it, supreme leader, or the person that is primarily responsible effectively for the security of Canada, submarines, tanks, ships, et cetera, even satellites that we're completely reliant on America for our satellites. And then, frankly, there was one article that was a little bit disturbing in the Globe and Mail on Saturday this weekend that was saying that Canada should have its own nuclear capability. Maybe it comes down to just how much we should be spending as a percentage of GDP on defense. But what do the two of you think should be the conversation about and the policies on national defense in this election campaign? Tony Clement, maybe I could start with you, sir.
Sure. And again, Sergio is right. These kinds of issues rarely take the fore in federal election campaigns, but this may be a bit of an outlier that way. And I was very pleased to see Pierre travel to Nunavut a couple of weeks ago, talking about how we have to be secure our sovereignty in the Arctic. Stephen Harper understood that very well. If sovereignty is very simple, unless you use it, you lose it. And we haven't been exercising our sovereignty to protect our interests in the Arctic over the Trudeau years. So that's got to change. And I'm hoping both political parties understand that. To be honest with you, as a Canadian, we need to have a more robust military. We have to, and it's going to take choices. Sergio knows better than most. When you make that kind of choice for the military, you can't spend on everything. So something's got to drop off the table. But it's so important, so I'm hoping to see both parties have robust plans for enhancement of our military. And quite frankly, that'll make us good continental partners with the United States. But regardless of the status of our relationship with the United States, again, you cannot have sovereignty unless you are able to defend your sovereignty. That's just the way the world works. Europe is learning that as well, by the way. For too long, they relied on the U.S. umbrella, and President Trump has cut them loose from that, and they're taking measures to enhance their military training and spending. And I believe we have to do the same thing. And I believe that Pierre Poilievre understands that.
Sergio,
I agree.
The Canadian government was talking about getting to 2% spending on GDP on defense by 2030 or something like that. Now, Mark Carney and others are talking about 2026 or 2027. What do you think the strategy should be, and what about where we should be spending our dollars?
Yeah, Tony mentioned earlier, it's about events, right? That's what Churchill said, and that's what makes politics go or not. And so I think military issues, will be louder and clearer in this election because of the event of Donald Trump. He hasn't shown himself to be a friend and an ally to Canada. And Canada has been blessed by geography for so many years in putting us next door to the superpower. But now it's under Trump, it's become a curse of sorts. Can you imagine the G7 in Kananaskis when the G6 leaders will want to talk about how do you protect your country against Donald Trump, and he's at the table? Talk about awkwardness. So there's no question that the arrival of Donald Trump for both Canada as well as Europe, as Tony mentioned, we don't know what's going to come after Donald Trump. We can't assume you're going to get a more traditional-like president. You got to prepare and plan for the worst. So people now have had their trust shattered, which means that we have to look after ourselves. We have to build and strengthen those old alliances that are still working. And it means paying our fair share to protect our sovereignty. Again, we've taken, I think, the easy road, and Canadians in poll after poll wanted a bigger, more secure, robust social safety net than they did military. But if you're going to ask Canadians today the same question, I would predict that that mood has shifted tremendously. So sovereignty, national economic growth and prosperity are job one. And Tony is absolutely right. You can't be all things to all people. If we're going to accentuate higher expenditures on military, it's got to come at the cost of not a not important issue, but today's times a less important, less of a priority. And we've got to be big enough to do that. That's why I applaud that Carney shrank his cabinet, shrank a number of files to make it more focused. And so that's what we need is focused, prioritized government action.
Okay, so let me ask you about another issue, if I could, Sergio. Pipelines, energy. A couple of years ago, maybe even last year, people would have been generally against a pipeline across Canada, particularly in the province of Quebec, which was very in opposition to a pipeline. Now, that appears to be different, where people are talking about Northern Gateway again, as well as an east-west pipeline, liquefied natural gas facilities, etc. What do you think will be the conversation, or should be the conversation, about energy and infrastructure during the campaign?
I always felt uncomfortable that we weren't nation building when it came to pipelines. You know, our forefathers built the Trans-Canada Highway. They built the railway. They built the CBC infrastructure east-west to counter the north-south pull of the United States. And so I think, again, this crisis should not be lost when we talk about our energy and natural resources. We send almost 95% of our oil to United States and on a reduced cost. And right now, we just can't afford that. Donald Trump says he doesn't need our oil, doesn't need our gas, doesn't need our wood, which is BS. He needs all of that, and he's particularly thirsty about oil. But we need to diversify. Clearly, 60% of our minerals go to the United States. So obviously, we've been talking diversification until the cows came home, but I never blamed our business people for dipping their export toes in the American waters, because it was the superpower market, it was next door, and they spoke English. But now that scenario has changed. So of course we have to bring our oil both to the Atlantic and Pacific and ship it out to our European friends and our Asian friends. Now that's going to take time. It'll take a decade to build that infrastructure. But every day we lose is another day that we're vulnerable to the likes of a Donald Trump. So we, as Mark Carney said yesterday, we have to build, and that includes pipelines. And I think, with all due respect, we've been a hostage of legal, environmental, and indigenous. Now, all three are absolutely important, but they have to take a backseat to what I would say is an urgent national emergency of protecting our economy and protecting our sovereignty. And that means, as Tony said earlier, choosing. And that's what leadership is about.
Tony, what do you think about energy and infrastructure?
Yeah, well, I think the Conservatives have been on this file for over a decade and have pointed to liberal laws passed in Parliament that have retarded our ability to get our energy to tidewater, to dig up our critical minerals, to get economic development activity going in indigenous communities. It's all part of this puzzle where things became so bureaucratized that people just gave up and walked away from Canada. We lost tens of billions, not just billions, but tens of billions in investment because of our bureaucratic regulatory overreach that was part of liberal legislation. So, yeah, I mean, Mark Carney is talking a good game, adopting conservative stances on this. But can I say for the record that, you know, his past experiences, his past speeches and writings and activities was 180 degrees towards seeing the world solely through the lens of carbon neutral or carbon zero policies. So this is quite a turnaround. It's kind of giving me whiplash a little bit that Mark Carney now has incarnated himself as a big backer for our oil and gas sector or our critical mineral sector. That's not what he was talking about weeks ago, let alone months and years ago. So I guess the Canadian public's going to have to decide whether he's legit serious about this or not. I know Pierre Poilievre is serious about it, and I know that he's been consistent on this for years. So again, this is going to be a proof point in the election campaign.
I think interprovincial trade barriers are going to be an issue people talk about, but it appears to me that both parties probably have similar points of view. Are there other policies that you think might come to the fore? Defund the CBC is one, for an example, that might be different. Are there points of difference from a policy standpoint that you think might end up might be important? Tony, to you?
Well, I think tax policy is going to be interesting to see how that plays out. I saw Mark Carney at his speech at Rideau Hall yesterday talk about a middle class tax cut. So he's on that bandwagon now. I would predict, I have no way of knowing, I'm just a humble volunteer in the Conservative Party these days, so I have no inside knowledge, but I would predict that there will be a substantive tax cut proposed by Pierre Poilievre to try to get our economy moving and to get our GDP per capita up to where it should be. So that's going to be maybe a point of contention about how far to go on this. Now that Mark Carney has come out with his tax policy, it gives Pierre Poilievre the opportunity to say something somewhat different on that. So I think you're going to see something on that. And housing, of course, Pierre Poilievre has been on that issue for years. We're starting to see the Liberals sort of belatedly realize that their housing policy sucked. The one thing that you haven't mentioned, though, it may be a sleeper issue. I'd love to hear what Sergio has to say about this, but immigration. There's been some chatter on the internet that one of Carney's advisors is one of these people that advocates for 100 million people to be in Canada by the end of the century or something like that. I'm not so sure that everyone is quite comfortable with the rate of immigration that we've had. We've been a country that has been welcoming of immigrants. I'm an immigrant. Sergio, you may be an immigrant. I don't know. But that consensus has broken down because of Justin Trudeau and his policies, because they went too far, too fast. And so if that might be a very interesting topic of conversation in this election as well.
Sergio, you, other policies?
Yeah, you mentioned, first of all, I go back to my opening theory that I think most of the airtime will be taken by issues relating to the $64,000 question, the gorilla in the room called Donald Trump and what he means for Canada. I think something like defunding the CBC can be one of those issues, which I think frankly is silly for Pierre to advocate, particularly at a time when we need a united country and to talk about our stories and to talk about things Canadian. Doing away with the CBC, really, at this time? It'll be interesting to see if he ever talks about that again. I think migration always has the potential to be a sleeper. We've seen how migration has poisoned the political well in so many different countries. You actually got political movements created around anti-migration sentiment. And we've been largely able to avoid that trap. There's been an unwritten consensus between the major parties that immigration is positive, that we all differ about how do you do immigration settlement or the rate, but we don't argue about it being positive or negative. So the rate, I think, was a concern, especially when housing was a concern for the last number of years, that people thought we were bringing in too many too quickly, and that the housing and economic marketplace wasn't able to digest it properly. I think Trudeau, at the end of his mandate, and certainly Carney has continued, is to tone that down. And I think that's acceptable. And in that case, I'm not suspecting that migration will be that outlier, except if the former Tory, who's running again in both the national, what is it called, the National Party or
No, the PPC.
the PPC, they've tried to make migration an issue the last couple of times. But the last time I checked, they didn't have a high popular vote, nor do they have a seat in Parliament.
We're going to take a break for some messages and come back with some concluding questions and comments from our two guests, the Honorable Sergio Marchi and the Honorable Tony Clement, in just 2 minutes. Fascinating conversation, gentlemen. Thank you so much for joining us. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. The Honorable Sergio Marchi and the Honorable Tony Clement are my guest panelists tonight to talk about the federal election campaign. Second to last question. How important are the debates? I would have thought that debates this time, given the short campaign and the lack of knowledge people have, at least about Mark Carney, but also Pierre Poilievre, debates are going to be really critical. What do you guys think?
Yeah, I agree. It should be. Yeah. Sorry, Sergio.
No, go ahead.
Yeah, no, it should be. I question generally whether these mainstream media activities are as, whether they have the impact that they used to have 20 and 30 years ago. I think you have to recognize that our media consumption is very different now. But maybe people watch it on YouTube or TikTok Reels or something. But typically with this situation, I agree with you. I just question whether mainstream media activities are going to be as important. I think podcasts are going to be a lot more important than the debates.
Well, I think that because of the notoriety of this particular campaign with Donald Trump as the threat and nemesis, I think we'll even have a higher focus on leaders, which probably is unfair. We've got many good candidates, members of parliament. They'll become essentially an afterthought in a debate that's going to revolve around national unity, national sovereignty, and therefore so much more attention on the leaders of the day, which I think means that the debates have the potential to be a high wire act. I agree with Tony. Media has changed, but if you have a knockout punch in a debate, it'll be felt across the country and alter the playing field, just the way Mulrooney scored against Turner in 1984, and to a lesser degree in 1988 going to Turner. Those two debates turned the fate of the campaign. We might see it again, or if there's no scratches, there'll be non-entities.
So, Sergi, given Pierre Poilievre's, 20 years in Parliament, asking some of the toughest questions in question period and his experience with debates, if you were preparing Mark Carney for the upcoming debate, how would you do it?
Yeah, they're both going to debate. They're going to obviously have people from their parties playing the other guys. I would always urge, particularly with going in a debate with Pierre, who I think will try to get under Mark Carney's skin. One of the pieces of advice to Mark would be who you are. You're credible, you're calm, you're reflective, you're astute, you're decent, you're not negative, you're not angry. Be who you are. Let Pierre go to town on the angry stuff, and people will note that. So I think composure is key. And I think secondly, when he talks economically, because he's so gifted on the economic side, don't go too deep into the weeds, because then Canadians won't know what you're talking about. Use the playbook of Doug Ford. Speak in plain language when it comes to economic futures for Canadians and for our country. But above all, be composed. This guy's going to try to sucker punch you and try to draw you into saying things you might regret. And I hope that he resists that temptation.
Tony, same question to you. How would you prepare Pierre Poilievre? I had people on my show last week that said, best leader of the official opposition everywhere, best questioner everywhere, but he doesn't sound prime ministerial. How would you have him change his style?
I think his style has evolved. Of course, we all recall the time where he demolished Mark Carney at the parliamentary committee questioning a few years ago. But no, But I would change it a little bit from what Sergio is saying. I think there's a strategy in the English language debate, and I think there's a different strategy for Pierre in the French language debate. I think in the English language debate, I do think he's got to be calm as well. And composed as well, but he's got to make his points, and he will make his points. In the French language debate, I would advise Pierre to be passionate, because the Quebecers love passion in their leaders. I think of Jack Layton during that debate in 2011. He was off the Richter scale in terms of passion, right? So I think that and Quebecers are not sold on Pierre. We know that, but I think if they see the passionate side of him, that might change. So yeah, different strategies, different tonality, I would say, in the two debates is what I'd advise Pierre.
Last question, 10 seconds each. What's your prediction, Sergio?
Minority government, Carney.
Tony?
Majority government, CPC.
This is going to be one of the most interesting elections in history. And I think that Sergio and Tony were both right when they said that this is comparable of import to 1988 and the referendum on free trade. And so I think that this is going to be one for the history books. And I do think that the debates are going to be critically important. And I wonder, and I won't ask you this question, but I wonder, when John Turner said, if you give up your economic sovereignty first, political sovereignty is sure to come. And so I wonder whether John Turner was right. And hopefully he was wrong, and we can prove him wrong by ensuring that we remain a sovereign, free, separate country. Stay with us for the Brian Crombie Radio Hour every day during this election campaign, because we're going to have lots of interesting guests and conversations about it every night on 9:60 a.m., 6 p.m., Monday through Friday. You can stream me online at www.saga960am.ca. All my podcasts and videos go up on my website and on podcast servers and on YouTube as soon as the radio show goes to air. Sergio, Tony, I really appreciate you joining us. Please come back. Good night, everybody.
Thank you.